Concept for tonight: does Christ's priesthood include animal sacrifices? I'm putting forward yes, it does. Hebrews 5 tells us Christ is a priest forever. This is a prophecy fulfilled from Psalm 110, 1 through 4, as well as Isaiah 53. And so this is he's in the Melchizedek order. He's a priest forever. So if we look at the timeline of history from creation, Noah's flood to Mount Sinai, Christ's resurrection, even his ascension, we see that the moment of his ascension, according to Hebrews chapter 5, 6 through 10, that's when he's made perfect. That's when he's been inaugurated in his priesthood and been ordained as high priest in the Melchizedek order in heaven's temple. And that's going to be going forward forever, from his ascension to heaven on into eternity, through the millennial reign and unto forever. He will be high priest of the covenant. And so this is what takes place during that timeline. Acts 21:26 does, where the apostles, James and Peter, instructing Paul to go give a number 6 vow, purification, and offering, which completes that actual instruction from the Torah. That's happening during Christ's priesthood on the earth. And we know the tabernacle on the earth was a copy of the one made in heaven. The one in heaven, the true sanctuary, is where Christ is actually ministering right now. That's happening during his priesthood. Even 65 AD, one of the disciples of the apostles, Clement of Rome, in his letter to the Corinthians, the same Corinthians that Paul wrote to, he says, they therefore that make their offerings at the appointed seasons are acceptable and blessed, for while they follow the institutions of the master, they can't go wrong. And so, of course, he's making this declaration before the temple was destroyed in AD 70, because it was still being used on the earth by Christians to bring forth their offerings for this Shavuot, for Sukkot, for unleavened bread, for all those things, as we see the apostles observing in Acts 18 through 20. We also have, this is something I just want to put out there as we get going here. The common confusion over this topic really hinges on these two central ideas. One, the dispute on whether God's law is his character and his way of life in heaven above, and is his law the eternal expectation of all mankind on the earth below. This blends into aspects of eschatology and antinomian forms of dispensation theology. The other confusion about this is how people define the resurrection and the new covenant. So these concepts, eschatology, antinomian forms of dispensation, resurrection, and new covenant, these are all things that blend into the confusion of this discussion, and I hope to make some clarity on that tonight. So what is this role that Christ holds forever as a high priest of the Melchizedek order? It's repeated to us so many times. It's Hebrews 2, Hebrews 5, Hebrews 6. He enters in the sanctuary, behind the curtain, high priest forever on our behalf. Hebrews 7:21. He was made a priest with an oath, not based on genealogical succession. He's a priest forever. He always lives to intercede for us. That's active present tense. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1 through 1 and 2 tells us he's in the true sanctuary in heaven, the true tabernacle, not the copy on the ground, but the true one in heaven, actively ministering. That's present tense language. Also, Hebrews 9, Christ is a mediator of the new covenant, parallels 1 Timothy. This is something that's a present tense actively, and a high priest, we're going to go into the definitions of what a priest, according to the law of God, does, is someone who's mediating on behalf of the people in the tabernacle or the sanctuary of the Almighty. Hebrews 9:21 through 24 explains that according to the law, things within that, the structure, the furniture, the vessels, the utensils, things within the sanctuary of God are purified with the blood. And so that's why in verse 23, it says it's necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. What makes it better? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Hebrews 9:21 through 24, again, is a powerful lead in to the end of chapter 9, which it explains to you that the Son, his first appearance on the earth, was to bear the sins of the many. His second time will be to bring salvation to those who eagerly await him. So we're going to talk in a few minutes about and break down the idea of what it means to bear the sins of the many, because that's an extremely important point in pertaining to the context of a priest. Chapter 10, 1 through 7 is a great breakdown on the law being a shadow of the good things to come, not the very image of the things. It doesn't mean that things are different. It just means they're less in certainty because they're a shadow. Men were frail, beset with weaknesses, failing to do their job faithfully on the earth, which is why we had this lead up from chapter 7 in Hebrews about the Levite priests on the earth and how Christ is superior to them. And the sacrifices they were bringing do not make perfect those who draw near to worship. Now, it's interesting that this word about not cleansing the conscience and not making them perfect because the blood of bulls and goats does not take away or remove sins. That's true, and I agree with that. Because atonement is a covering over of sins. The removal of sins, the taking away of sins, happens at the resurrection when Christ raises you incorruptible. That's the contextual difference. So this is why he then follows up in this passage, verse 6 and 7, where Christ is, or the writer of Hebrews is speaking about Christ, repeating Old Testament prophecies and psalms about him being given a body that was prepared for him to do the will of the Father, which was the prophesied priesthood that he was sent to become. And so then you get into Romans 8, 10, 14. This is usually the big verse that everyone thinks, oh, well, sacrifices are done away with. The moment that Christ entered heaven, then he just sat down with the right hand of the Father. He's not doing anything else. He's just sitting up there chilling, and he's not doing the same duties as priests did in the copy on the ground. And so there's a different standard of behavior for Christ's priesthood, and they usually hinge themselves. I'm not sure what Rabbi is going to say tonight, but all the arguments I've heard for years and years is based off Hebrews 10:14. Well, they'll say, since that time he awaits for his enemies to be made a footstool for his feet, because by a single offering he's made perfect for all time those who are being sanctified. Well, for one, no one's been made perfect yet. That happens at the resurrection, this concept of being made whole and complete. I do not believe in Augustinian imputed righteousness. Right now, we are being sanctified, present tense, active language, because we're discipling. At the resurrection is when he actually makes us perfect and complete, just like Paul repeats in Philippians 3:12. So for him, this one single offering was the offering of his body, which is the previous context in this passage, as you can see highlighted above. But let's dig in a little bit, because what comes before Hebrews chapter 10 is Hebrews 2, where it directly tells you that Christ became a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God in order to make atonement for the sins of the people. In service to God is active present tense language. In order to make atonement for the sins of the people, that is the job of a priest ministering in the sanctuary of the Almighty. And he's doing that for us on our behalf. Chapter 5 comes before chapter 10 also. Every high priest is appointed from among men to represent them in matters relating to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. Christ also is responsible for this as well. Hebrews 7, 24 and 25, he's always living to intercede for them. Present tense language of a priest in heaven doing his job. Hebrews 8, 1 through 2, he's actively ministering in the sanctuary of the true tabernacle, not the copy on the ground. This is a present tense language. There is no other definition for what a priest does in the actual sanctuary of the Almighty. And of course, Hebrews 9:23 comes before chapter 10, where it tells you that the things inside the heavenly temple are sanctified, purified with better sacrifices, because Christ is perfect. He's not a frail and weak human beset with sin. He's glorified, he's perfected, he is without sin, and he pleases the Father. His sacrifices are infinitely better. And so this is why he's our forever high priest. He'll never be replaced. Big point here I want to stress real quick is he came the first time to bear the sins of many. Hebrews 9:28. This also is the context before chapter 10, verse 14. Let's look a little bit on what it means for a priest to bear sins. Leviticus 10:17. Moses explained to Aaron how he should eat the sin offering in the holy place, because it's been given to him to bear the guilt of the congregation and make atonement for them before Yahweh. Same thing in Numbers 18:1. Yahweh says to Aaron, you and your sons, your father's house must bear the iniquity involving the sanctuary. That's what we just read from Hebrews 9:23. You and your sons alone must bear the iniquity involving your priesthood. Exodus 28:38. It will be worn on Aaron's forehead so that he may bear the iniquity, that's the word for sin, of the holy things that the sons of Israel consecrate with regard to all their holy gifts. Again, Hebrews 9:23. Isaiah 53:11, and the prophecy about Christ being the Messiah, the servant sent to become our Savior, also to become our high priest. My righteous servant will justify many. He will bear their iniquities. That's the job of a priest. So what else is before Hebrews chapter 10? Mark 11, Christ tells us, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, not a den of robbers? He's quoting directly from Isaiah 56:7, where it tells us that foreigners, not Israel, but foreigners who are grafted into the commonwealth of Israel will join themselves to Yahweh and minister to him. That's a role for a priest. He says they'll bring them to his holy mountain, make them joyful in his house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on his altar. Nowhere in history, nor in modernity, have foreigners become priests to Yahweh. The Levites are on the earth, but inside the kingdom of heaven, which is the chief mountain, the holy mountain that descends, the tabernacle of Yahweh, that descends during the millennial reign, that's where the resurrected saints are put into a priesthood under Christ in this Melchizedek order and actually minister to the Father to facilitate this prophecy. It's very important. It's right here in plain language. Sacrifices will be accepted, even burnt offerings, which are atonement offerings. This is why we're promised to be put into this royal priesthood, as Peter explains. Also, as Revelation talks about, we'll be made priests of God after the first resurrection. Again, this is how we facilitate the wonderful promise that all nations will be able to come and their offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on the altar at Zion, at the New Jerusalem, at the holy mountain of Yahweh. Zechariah 14, all nations will also be required to celebrate Sukkot, which I know that our rabbi understands that atonement offerings are made every day of Sukkot. So this is concepts that it tells you in verse 20 and 21 that they'll grab pots that'll be holy to the Lord and use them for sacrifice. This is unambiguous language, very clear, very specific. All nations will come to Jerusalem and sacrifice. This has never happened in history. It's not happened in modernity. Happens during the millennial reign as all nations are drawn to the house of Yahweh to learn the law of Yahweh. So we also have in Ezekiel 45 the same promise: sin offerings, grain offerings, burnt offerings, peace offerings to make atonement for the house of Israel. All the people of the land must participate in this concept, not just for special events like the feast of the Lord, but also new moon, Sabbaths, and every other thing required. So it's going to be a wonderful time. This is how there's peace on the earth. Now, just a little one slide, just for all the people out there that may have given in to some of the reinterpretation of some crowds that try to claim that Ezekiel 40 through 48 is talking about a fictitious, hopeful sanctuary that never got built in ancient Israel. The tree of life, the sanctuary flowing out from the throne of God with the fruit from the tree of life, was never promised to be a part of any temple in ancient Israel. This is synonymous, Ezekiel 47:12 and Revelation 22. The fruit from the trees of life used for the healing of the nations, flowing from the water out from under the sanctuary. These are all parallel. These are the concepts that are applied to the kingdom when the Father's tabernacle, his sanctuary, descends on the earth. So, what does God's word say about his judgments, testimonies, commandments, statutes, precepts? He calls the opposite of commandment keepers evildoers in Psalm 119, 115. He calls those who have strayed from his statutes, he calls them deceit. They're in deceitfulness. He says that his righteousness, which I know that Brother Rabbi believes that is the right behavior of God, his righteousness is everlasting. His law is true. His law is never not true. It's always true. The testimonies are righteous forever. They equal your salvation. You are near, O Lord. All your commandments are true. They're never not true. The entirety of your word is truth. The entirety, that includes sacrifices, temple instructions, everything involved. The entirety of your word is truth. All your righteous judgments endure forever. In fact, he told us in Psalm 103:7, Psalm 119, 1 through 3, that he gave his ways to Moses, that those who walk blameless and according to the law of the Lord are walking in his ways. And this word in the Hebrew is for his moral character, his actions, his course of life. This is not arbitrary. This wasn't just given to Israel. This is expected of all mankind to repent and come to the Lord. And this is his ways that he practices in heaven. Hebrews 8, again, 1 through 5. The temple on the ground was a copy of what is in heaven. So the sanctuary that was on the ground, the Levites practiced in, is a copy of what's already taking place in the heavenlies. And because I do believe heaven's a real place, corporeal and tangible. This is why we're supposed to keep the commandments according to Revelation 22:14, so that we can enter into the city, the New Jerusalem, to the tree of life through its gates, because outside of it are those who practice falsehoods. We practice the commandments now because at the resurrection, his laws are put on our heart and mind. We will do them forever in eternity. Where does Paul get this understanding of God serving principalities and powers in heavenly places that we see him talking about in Ephesians 1, chapter 3, chapter 8 of Romans, and also Peter talks about this in 1 Peter 3. Principalities, powers, mights, and dominions above. They get it from a book that is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and was in the Armenian 14th century canon. It's the Testament of Levi, chapter 3, verses 3 through 10, as it explains the 7 layers of the firmament, of which the highest layer is where the Almighty is, as it says, and in the highest of all, the 7th heaven dwells the great glory far above all holiness. This is in line with Deuteronomy 10:14. In the 6th heaven are the archangels who minister. That's a word for priests, and they make propitiation to the Lord for all the sins of ignorance of the righteous, offering as Lord a sweet-smelling savor, a reasonable and bloodless offering. It's cooked. That's why it's sweet-smelling. It's bloodless offering in alignment with Torah, as you're supposed to drain the blood out before you offer it to the Almighty. So there's a ton here. Songs of Sabbath Sacrifice, also found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, talks about the angelic priesthood in heaven ministering in the temples above. But what does the Almighty actually instruct for atonement? This is important. Specifically, atonement to be made in his sanctuary. We're not talking about Romans 3:25 or Phineas killing the Simeonite to atone for the plague. We're talking about temple sanctuary atonement. It requires non-human stuff: structures, furniture, tools, and food. These are all the things required and all the scriptures adjacent for temple sanctuary atonement. What about non-human requirements? What kind of man is allowed to step before Yahweh and offer a sacrifice for atonement? It has got to be under a certain classification, a Melchizedek or a Levite. He's got to have a circumcised heart. He's got to have a circumcised body and be clean and washed according to the regulations of the Torah. This is why our heavenly, wonderful, glorified Messiah embodies all of this in a perfect tabernacle as a perfect resurrected man who is no longer without sin. Hebrews 2:17, 100%, he's a faithful and merciful high priest in service to God in order to make atonement for the sins of the people. This is happening now. And so I thank you for my time, and I look forward to the following discussion.